Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is writer Karen Thompson Walker, Assistant Professor of Creative Writing at the University of Oregon. Thompson Walker is the author of the New York Times bestselling novel The Age of Miracles, and most recently, The Dreamers, which was published in January of 2019. She gave a reading at the University of Oregon on February 13th, 2019. Thanks, Karen, for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So how did you come to be a writer? How did you figure out that that's what you were going to do with yourself?
Oh, that's a big question. I always loved writing as a child. I think I went through a period, like as a young child, I wrote little stories and I entered writing contests in elementary school and that kind of thing, and it was always my favorite subject, writing and reading. But I feel like then I went through a time, maybe high school, where I kind of associated it with childhood, I think. Like it was like, okay, now time to figure out sort of what am I going to do, in real life or something. And so then, but when I got to college, I took creative writing classes at UCLA, one with Amy Bender and one with Mona Simpson. And those really, it was sort of this awakening that, adults write books, which I knew obviously, but just that it could be a real career maybe, or a thing to take seriously. And I sort of dropped that association with, childhood. And I got just really excited about it and took as many creative writing classes as I could, as well as my English classes.
And, for a number of years you were a professional writer, and then you've decided to come into the academy. You want to say something about that?
Yeah, I used to, so I did my MFA, a graduate degree in writing, and then I needed to get a job, and the job I took at first was, I went into book publishing, so I was an assistant first, and then became a book editor, and I just loved the idea of being close to books, and I was at the same time writing my own books, so I always imagined that I would have some kind of balance like that, where I'd have a day job at the same time as pursuing writing, but eventually I started to feel like book publishing was not a great balance, both literally in time. It just the kind of reading hours were hard. It was hard to fit in my writing around it, and just all the endless meetings and stuff. So I could feel that wasn't going to work. And then I feel like in academia, of course, that same risk exists, but there is a bit of a built-in idea that it is part of my job to keep publishing books and keep writing books. So I appreciated that, and I also feel like teaching has been great for my writing in a way that book publishing, being up close to the kind of marketing side of books was not great for me, psychologically, for an artist to be that close. Whereas academia, working with students on their own writing and trying to articulate the things that I have maybe come to understand about storytelling, those things are it's just a side pleasure, of course, but it's also good for my own writing.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about The Dreamers. The novel begins with an epigraph from the Portuguese Nobel laureate José Saramago's novel Blindness, and the quote is, "That night the blind man dreamt that he was blind." Tell us first why you selected a quotation from Saramago's Blindness.
Well, Blindness is one of my favorite books, and it's just been a major influence for me for both of my books. And I think it was the first book that I read. I read it in graduate school, where it took a kind of fantastical premise that was kind of wild and crazy. It's a city suddenly, an epidemic of blindness, a strange, mysterious blindness suddenly spreads through a city. And of course that's an imaginary premise, but then it took it so seriously. So to me it feels like, it's not exactly realism in the traditional sense, but it feels incredibly realistic and convincing and serious. And there was something exciting about that combination for me, to have this wild, fantastical premise, but taken so seriously, and to have such an interest in just the human experience of that situation. So that has just been an important book for me always. And then of course this time, so when I started thinking about writing a story of my own that involved a mysterious contagious sickness, it felt natural to see if I could use a quote from that book. And then of course there is this line about dreams, and I feel like, to me, the meaning, I hope, is in that case it was like that the dreams are always, whether it's our ordinary dreams, or these sort of extraordinary dreams that take place in my book, dreams are always connected to our actual real situations and our real psyches. They're not separate. And so that's what I hope that quote would suggest.
So you've begun to hint at the premise, but tell us what the premise of your book is.
Right. I guess I got ahead of myself. So yes, The Dreamers is the story of a strange, contagious sickness, a sleeping sickness that is spreading through a small college town. And so it begins on a college dorm floor and eventually spreads out through the community. And eventually, and the symptom is just endless sleep. People, they just can't wake up. And so after a while, it becomes clear that it's not just sleep, but it also involves some strange kind of otherworldly dreams.
They detect that they're in REM sleep, and then they do these, they track their brain waves and discover these people are dreaming more intense dreams than have ever been dreamt.
Yes.
So, would you mind reading the beginning of the novel for us?
Sure. Thank you. At first, they blame the air. It's an old idea, a poison in the ether, a danger carried in by the wind. A strange haze is seen drifting through town on that first night, the night the trouble begins. It arrives like weather, or like smoke, some say later, but no one can locate any fire. Some blame the drought, which has been bleeding away the lake for years and browning the air with dust. Whatever this is, it comes over the town quietly. A sudden drowsiness, a closing of the eyes. Most of the victims are found in their beds. But there are some who will tell you that this sickness is not entirely new, that its cousins have sometimes visited ours. In certain letters from earlier centuries, you may find the occasional reference, decades apart, to a strange kind of slumber, a mysterious, persistent sleep. In 1935, 2 children went to bed in a Dust Bowl cabin and did not wake for 9 days. Some similar contagion once crept through a Mexican village. El Niente, they called it, the nothing. And 3,000 years before that, a Greek poet described a string of strange deaths in a village near the sea. They died, he wrote, as if overcome by sleep. Or, according to a second translation, as if drowned in a dream. This time it starts at the college. It starts with a girl leaving a party. She feels sick, she tells her friends, like a fever, she says, like the flu, and tired, too. As tired as she has ever felt in her life. 2. The girl's roommate, May, will later recall waking to the sound of the key turning in the lock. May will remember the squeak of the springs in the dark as her roommate, her name is Kara, climbs into the bunk above hers. She seems drunk, this girl, the way she moves so slowly from door to bed. But the room is dim, and, as usual, they do not speak. In the morning, May sees that Kara has slept in her clothes. The narrow black heels of her boots are sticking out beneath the blankets of the upper bunk. But May has seen her do this once before. She is careful not to wake her as she dresses. She is quiet with her keys and with the door. She leaves only the slightest possible impression on the space, the comfort of not being seen. This is California, Santa Laura, 6 weeks into May's freshman year. May stays away from the room all day. She feels better this way, still stunned by how quickly it happened, how the friendships formed without her, a thick and sudden ice. Each evening, Kara and the other girls on the floor stand in towels in the bathroom, blocking the sinks as they lean toward the mirrors to line their lips and eyes. May can hear them laughing from the desk in her room across the hall, their voices loud above the hum of the blow dryers. It takes time to get to know people, her mother said over the phone. Sometimes it takes years. But there are certain stories that May has not told her mother, like those boys who came to the door the first week of school. There was a bad smell in the hall, they'd said, and they'd tracked it to this room. It's like something died in here, they'd said, walking in without asking, filling up the narrow room, flip-flops and board shorts, baseball caps low on their heads. The boys got excited when they began to sniff around May's desk. That's it, they'd said, pressing their hands to their noses. It's gotta be something in there. They'd pointed to the bottom drawer. What the hell do you have in there? It was her mother's dried cod, which had arrived in the company of 3 bars of dark chocolate and 2 lavender soaps. My mom makes it, she'd said. This is one of her mother's few inheritances from her own mother, May's grandmother, the only one in the family born in China and not San Diego. It's fish. She knows that these boys refer to her as quiet girl, as in, hey, quiet girl, it's okay to talk. She does not think of herself that way, as especially quiet. But there she was, as if under their sway, suddenly not talking. Jesus, said the one named Tom, who is taller than the others and plays basketball for the school team. He'd tied a red bandana around his face, like a co-worker in a Civil War hospital. That is foul, he said. Every time she remembers it, that bandana over his face, her face turns hot with the shame of it. In the end, she dropped the bag of cod down the trash chute at the end of the hall, 10 floors down, the scrape of plastic on tin, while the boys gathered around her to make sure. Later, her roommate apologized. I didn't know they'd be like that, Kara said. This is how she learned that Kara was the one who told the boys about the smell in the room, though she'd said nothing at all to May. This is one of the reasons that May spends her afternoons at a campus cafe, where, on this particular day in October, she waits until she is sure her roommate and the other girls will be gone from the floor, their hair dryers quiet, their flat irons cool, and the girls themselves enmeshed by then in the complicated rituals of sorority life. The boys, she hopes, will be at dinner. But when she gets back to the floor that night, 9 hours after she left it, she finds a note, written in red, on the whiteboard that hangs on their door. We're leaving, it says. Where are you? These words, it is obvious, are meant for her roommate. When May unlocks the door, she finds Kara still lying where she left her that morning, her body curled toward the wall in the top bunk, her black boots still protruding from the sheets. Kara, she says softly. Outside, the sun is sinking. The sky is clear and turning pink. May switches on the overhead light. Kara, she says again. But Kara does not wake, not to the sound of May's pleading or to the louder voices of the 2 paramedics who soon detect, through her badly wrinkled dress, that she is breathing at least, that she still has a pulse. Kara sleeps through the screaming of the other girls as they see the way her head rolls back against the stretcher, the way her mouth hangs open, her brown hair falling loose across her face. She sleeps through the screeching of the crickets in the pine trees outside and through the cool night air on her skin. May stands barefoot on the sidewalk as the paramedics slide the stretcher into the bright bubble of the ambulance. A little roughly, thinks May. Be careful, she wants to say. And then the doors swing shut without her, leaving May alone in the street. The paramedics will later report that the girl sleeps through the wail of the siren, too, and the flashing of the lights. She sleeps through the bumps of the potholed streets as the ambulance rushes toward St. Mary's, where, after several attempts, 2 doctors find that they cannot wake her either. On the other floors of the hospital that night, women labor while the girl sleeps. Babies are born while she sleeps. She sleeps while an old man dies in a distant room, an expected death, his family gathered, a chaplain. She sleeps through sunrise and she sleeps through sunset. And yet, in those first few hours, the doctors can find nothing else wrong. She looks like an ordinary girl sleeping ordinary sleep. There will be some confusion later about what happened to her there, how her heart could have slowed so much without setting off the monitors. But this much is known to be true. Over the course of many hours, her shallow breaths turn gradually shallower. It is hard to say afterward why the final beats of her heart go unrecorded by those machines.
So that passage, I think, gives a really good idea of the way you use realism to elaborate this premise that is fantastical. And also the kind of range of human experiences that this book is concerned with. What we don't get from this passage, though it's very evident, is that this isn't a story about May, though it is a story about May. It's a story about many people. Mm-hmm. There's probably 10 characters that are frequently recurred to. Say a little bit about the decision to have many characters. I know in your previous book it focused more on a single protagonist. Why did you make that choice?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was something about telling a contagion story that made it feel right. You know, I was interested in, I think one thing that interests me about contagion stories is the way that they inevitably sort of parallel the bonds between people. You know, the person who lives alone in the woods is never going to catch the thing that is spreading through humanity. So I was interested in charting that a bit. You know, how this strange sickness would spread between, you know, people who are close, friends and relatives, but also people who just pass each other in the hall, or, you know, or even, you know, or buy something in a store. You know, just capturing that feeling of the kind of truth of the community, of the way that humans live in such close proximity. So so anyway, I was interested in charting that passage of the sickness, and so that it felt like it felt natural to if I begin on a college dorm floor, it's going to spread through there, but then it's also going to spread out into the community. And so it just felt like natural and kind of, yeah, that it matched, that I would sort of pick up the story from each new person. I mean, it's not exactly quite that neat, but each new person that catches the sickness or is affected in some way by this sickness, you know, that we would go to that story.
Mm-hmm. So given that that's your procedure, you've chosen a third-person omniscient narrator. We can hear it from the passages that you read. And this narrator moves from each of these characters back and forth between these characters and tells us what's going on, how they're dealing with it, what's happening for them. But there's also interesting limitations on the omniscience of this narrator. What are some of the things this narrator cannot know or does not know?
Right.
And why did you make those choices?
I mean, my first book was first person, and I thought much less about what the rules of that voice were, because, you know, in a first person narration, the rules are how any of us speak about our own past. You know, what you could know about the past is what a you know, whatever is possible to our ear, you know. So in this book, a big part of the challenge at the beginning was figuring out, you know, the rules of this voice, and I wanted to be able to have that omniscient feel so that I could tell the story from this kind of maybe almost like a helicopter point of view at times, but then I really wanted to be able to zoom in close also. And I think one challenge about writing from an omniscient perspective is that theoretically, why is anything being withheld at any time? Right. You know, right. So that's managing that is, I think, just always something that you have to figure out. So in this case, just like on a kind of technical level, I made a rule for myself, which I think there's a few places that it departs from this, but it was useful for me, that each chapter, or at least each section, could only that voice could enter the head of only one person. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that was one rule, but I could zoom back out, you know, according to my own rules, but I had only one person at a time. So in that sense, like in a given scene, you know, you don't hear the other person's perspective. Mm-hmm. So that was one rule for myself that helped me organize it. But then in another way, once they're asleep, I guess I felt like they had access. Then at first I thought, when I first started writing it, that this omniscient narrator could have access to people, but not when they're asleep. You know, as if they have to be awake for the voice to get in. But then once I started to explore these dreams, like at a certain point, it was irresistible to me to not eventually capture the dreams from the inside.
Mm-hmm. But you held off on that for quite a long time in the novel.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, you know, some of that is, as a writer, it's experimentation, it's trial and error, and, you know, and I think I was interested in capturing what it would feel like to be on the outside of this mysterious, you know, if, you know, like there's a character whose wife, for example, falls asleep, and that sudden distance, I was interested in that. So I was at first, and for a long time, focused on, capturing what that would be like, but then later on, there's a dip into the inside.
So there are certain sort of larger social questions that you access. So one is climate change. So in the passage that you read, you note in passing that there's this lake that's central to the town, which is drying up. Mm-hmm. And there are a couple of other times, there's one of the things that happens at one point is there's a big wildfire that happens. Why did you? And I mean, and there's a character who's a kind of conspiracy theorist, survivalist type of character. Why did you want to put things? Was there some larger ambition to those kinds of inclusions?
I mean, I think I'm always trying to make my, you know, in both my books, I've chosen these fantastical premises. The first one, the rotation of the earth is slowing down, and this one, the sleeping sickness. But once I make that big leap, I want it to feel like realism. And so to me, including, references and elements about climate change, or like in the case, it's a drought in California in the book, feels like an element of realism, and it feels like I want it to take place right now, and that's something that is, it's happening to us and our planet right now, and it just feels realistic that we would have, that those things would be part of it. And then, perhaps the book is also interested in like a sense of doom and threat, that obviously climate change in the book and in real life is sort of one of the main threats that we as human beings, and I guess the non-humans as well, that we're all facing this huge threat. And so it just feels like it fits into my work.
So you've just spoken quite eloquently about the importance of realism for you. So what attracts you to this sort of speculative fiction? That is to say that you're beginning with this premise which, let's say, is not realistic.
Yeah.
Let's hope is not realistic. Why is that important?
I feel like that part feels a little more intuitive to me. Like, it might be hard for me to even say why these kinds of stories capture my imagination. And in a weird way, they unlock my access to everyday life. Like, it's a way of, it's actually for me a way of writing and giving a lot of attention to everyday life, and the ordinary bonds between people. And I think it's like I haven't quite figured out how to write. Of course, there's many great writers who do it, but I haven't quite figured out how to kind of make a story feel urgent and interesting if it's only about ordinary life. But in a weird way, putting these characters in this extreme situation, suddenly the small things like filling up a bottle for a baby or changing a baby's diaper take on this like sense of meaning that maybe we don't always feel, especially if it's not your own baby in the moment,
Did you have to do research about dreaming, about contagion, about plague, things like that? Did you do that kind of thing?
Yes, I did. I did a lot of research about. At first, I did a lot of research about contagion, and learned a lot of fascinating and some horrifying details. I mean, I feel like, I guess another thing about the fantastical stories is, I purposely wrote about a type of sickness that's not, it's not real. It has this element of kind of wonder to it. I wanted there to be this kind of extraordinary quality to it, but I wanted it to be believable as you read it. I mean, as you're reading it. So I learned about I did a lot of research about different kinds of sicknesses and how quickly different ones spread, and what would be the procedures that would be put in place in response if there was an outbreak of something new. And then I moved on as I got further. I kind of write in sequential order of the story. So I started to do more and more research on sleep and dreaming as I got further into the book, and that was just fascinating. I went to a conference of sleep researchers, which was very interesting. It was just all about different kinds of sleep disorders and things that affect sleep. And I watched, night vision footage of people experiencing night terrors and sleepwalking, or seizures in their sleep. There was a lot of fascinating territory to explore.
And you access a lot of this. I mean, there's a lot of sort of scientific kind of, there are sleepwalkers among those who get the sickness. And there are some passages where it's almost a kind of, you at periods become kind of philosophical about dreaming and speculating about, what are dreams, what do they do, what are they for? In some cases, it's like they're nothing. That's just where, built up stuff is processed. In other cases, you've spoken about the role of the imagination, in particular the importance of fear in the imagination. You want to say something about that?
I once did a TED talk about this idea that fear is actually an act of the imagination, which might explain why a lot of people who are why children have really wild imaginations, and then sometimes that leads to wild fears about monsters under the bed, or in my case was earthquakes in the middle of the night because I grew up in California. Although that that would fit in Oregon as well. Anyway, so I think there's just this natural, in a way, fear is this, fear is, the act of having a fear is, it's your imagination telling you a story about the future, a dark story. And so there's just this inevitable connection between those two things. And I don't know I forget what you asked at the start of that, but just, I think for me as a writer, that connection feels really deep between fear and the imagination. And in a way, I think writing these kind of scary stories, it's a way of, for me, it's like I'm accessing the track that my fears run on, but it's imaginary, and so I don't feel afraid, though. I'm not sure if readers feel scared.
So there's a couple of places in the novel where we get a sense of the sort of, that maybe these dreams that the dreamers have gave them some kind of special foresight, or, say a little bit about that decision on your part,
Yeah. I didn't set out to write. It's not like I knew that I was going to be writing about dreams. Like, it would have surprised me when I first started the book that I was going to be writing so much about dreams, but it just became increasingly fascinated, because I think it's just one of those, like, just ordinary real dreams are one of those elements of human life that are actually uncanny. Even though we do, it's every single day. Or maybe we don't always remember dreams, but we all have dreams. It's part of ordinary life, and yet when you look at it, it's really quite strange and mysterious, and yeah, it has this uncanny quality. So, so just dreams, ordinary dreams, I think have that quality. But then I was interested in doing something, maybe having these dreams be in some way different, and yeah, I'm also interested in time, and I've read, I'm no expert in physics, but I'm fascinated by the kind of, the idea that the way that human beings experience time, as a clear past, present, future, doesn't necessarily make sense in the context of, time in the universe. So I was interested in playing with that idea, and so I liked the idea that maybe this sleep and these dreams, in some way, jumbled or changed the way that people experienced time, and so then one of those ways is potentially seeing the future before we think it's happened.
Yeah, so there are these moments where the reader cannot determine whether these people are actually seeing the future or not.
Yes, right.
And so we've got like 20 seconds left, so this will be my last question. Have you read anything recently that you would recommend?
Let's see, I feel like I should use this to give you something really surprising that you haven't heard of, but I'm in the middle of Michelle Obama's memoir, and I just think it's amazing. Like, I knew I would be interested because I'm interested in her and she's amazing, but what I didn't realize is that there would be like so much art to the language. I mean, I'm actually listening to it on my drive, and I feel like she writes like a novelist, like a poet. I mean, I was, especially about her childhood, I wanted to write down the sentences and show them to my students, and that was just amazing. It's just amazing that among her other talents, she apparently is also a really gifted writer.
Well, thank you so much for that recommendation. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us about your book, The Dreamers. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
I've been speaking with the writer Karen Thompson Walker, Assistant Professor of Creative Writing at the University of Oregon. Thompson Walker is the author of the New York Times bestselling novel, The Age of Miracles, and most recently, The Dreamers, which was published in January of 2019. She gave a reading at the University of Oregon on February 13th, 2019. Thanks so much for watching.